Hello and welcome to a quick beginner's guide on how to use a camera in manual mode. First things first, when using a camera you need to adjust light and exposure time to get the best possible image. This is controlled by aperture, shutter speed and ISO. I will tell you all about that in a second. Before we start talking about manual settings, I want to explain this. If the camera receives too little light, the image becomes underexposed. If it receives too much light, the image becomes overexposed. A correctly exposed image is neither too bright nor too dark. I'll show you how to master this soon. Let's talk about aperture. The aperture is part of the camera lens that controls how much light enters the sensor. It's the small hole you see in the lens in the picture. A large aperture lets in more light, while a small aperture lets in less. It works like the pupil of your eye. When it's dark, your pupils get larger to take in as much light as possible. When it's bright, they shrink. Try looking in a mirror and see for yourself. Now let's talk about f-stop numbers. The f number represents the size of the aperture opening. A low f number means a large aperture that lets in more light and creates a shallow depth of field. A high f number means a small aperture that lets in less light but creates a deep depth of field. Shallow depth of field, deep depth of field. You might be wondering what that means. Let me explain. If you look at the image on the left, you'll see that only a small part is in focus while the background is blurred. This is a popular way to make the subject stand out. If you use a large aperture such as f2.8, you can achieve this effect. If you look at the image on the right, both the foreground and background are sharp. A small aperture like f11 creates this effect. Now, let's talk about shutter speed. The shutter is like a door in front of the camera sensor that opens and closes to let light in for a certain amount of time. Shutter speed determines how long light hits the sensor. A fast shutter speed, like 1/1000th of a second, freezes motion, perfect for sports and action shots. A slow shutter speed, like 1 second, lets in more light and creates motion blur, often used for low light photography and light trails. Here's another example. The image on the left has a fast shutter speed and captures every detail of moving water. The image on the right has a slow shutter speed, making the movement appear blurred. A large aperture, low f number, and a slow shutter speed allow a lot of light to enter the camera, which can result in an overexposed image, meaning it looks too bright. On the other hand, a small aperture, a high f number, and a fast shutter speed restrict the amount of light, which can lead to an underexposed image that appears too dark. To achieve the right exposure, you need to find a balance between these settings, ensuring that just the right amount of light reaches the camera sensor. Sometimes you want to brighten an image in dark environments without changing your shutter speed or aperture. That's when ISO comes in. ISO lets you increase brightness when needed. But ISO has its drawbacks. The higher the ISO, the more digital noise appears, making the image grainy. That's why it's best to keep ISO as low as possible for the best image quality. The image on the left was taken in daylight with ISO 200, while the one on the right was taken at night with ISO 8000. You can clearly see which one looks better, right? Now that we're this far in, let's talk about the most essential thing for taking a great photo: light. Let me give you some examples. Soft and even lighting occurs on cloudy days, in the shade, or when the sun is low, also known as the golden hour. Soft light reduces harsh shadows and creates beautiful images. Harsh sunlight creates high contrast and sharp shadows and is often not ideal. But of course it depends on the situation. Without natural light, you can use flashes and lamps. These provide a more controlled environment, where you can adjust brightness and direction. Something extremely important in photography is sharpness, how in focus your subject is. When photographing people or animals, sharpness is key. The focus is usually set on the eyes to ensure it's correctly adjusted. A blurry photo is often one to delete. So, how do you get sharp focus? by adjusting it correctly. You can either manually focus by turning the lens until the image is sharp or use autofocus. A lens is the camera's eye and consists of multiple glass elements that gather and focus light onto the camera's sensor. It affects sharpness, perspective, and light intake. There are different types of lenses. A standard lens, like a 50mm, gives a natural perspective similar to how we see with our eyes. It's great for portraits and general photography. A wide-angle lens, such as 10 to 35mm, is useful when you want to capture a lot in one frame. A telephoto lens, like 70 to 300mm, zooms in on distant subjects, perfect for getting close to something far away. Finally, to master photography in manual mode, you need to understand a few key things. Depending on your lighting conditions, you must balance aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. It's also crucial to get sharp focus, and depending on what you're photographing, you'll choose different lenses. Now it's time to practice. Grab your camera, shoot in manual mode, and experiment with the settings. Start by adjusting one thing at a time. Try different f-stops, shutter speeds, and ISO values to see how they affect the image. Thanks for watching, and good luck with your photography.